Welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed the coffee break. I see you do enjoy the conversation, and that's wonderful. Let us move on to the panel discussion. We will hear practitioners' perspectives on the Global Shield's potential. Various innovative financial solutions have been developed over the past decade to scale financial protection for vulnerable people. However, efforts are fragmented. Countries and people still face significant barriers for uptake, and the protection gap that you already talked about remains vast. The Global Shield's ambition is to deliver more systematic, sustained, and coherent financial protection. This session brings together a diverse group of practitioners who will look at how the Global Shield will operate to achieve these objectives. We will learn about practical experiences in implementing financial protection, which the Global Shields need to consider in order to unlock its full potential. We'll have a panel and we have Q&A here in the room and online. Please feel free to post questions in the chat and you can start anytime. Leah and Ines from the forum team are watching the chat and I will call on them later during the Q&A. One of our panelists, Theodore Talbot, Theo for short, is chief economist and will be giving us an overview presentation of the Global Shield's in-country approach and the Center for Disaster Protection's perspective on this approach. I would like to introduce Theodore Talbot, Theo for short. He's chief economist and assistant director for sustainable finance at the Center for Disaster Protection in London. I apologize. Before joining the center, Theo served as senior economist and innovative finance lead at the World Bank and has held senior roles at the Center for Global Development, building its sustainable finance work. He has also worked in the Pacific and in Vietnam. Welcome, Theo. We are looking forward to your introductory presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I just want to make sure this works. Lots of technical work has gone in here. Thank you so much for your time and your attention today. I was deeply inspired by the choir we had before us this morning in this kind of high church of multilateralism, and I seek to kind of put some flesh on the bones of what was discussed in terms of ambition by thinking about process. Dr. Kokofu and Dr. Hen mentioned very compellingly that the best is yet to come. I think my gentle challenge to all of us is that the best tends not to come on its own. Similarly, Red, again very eloquently, told us about action. I also think that action has to lead to results. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I believe the Global Shield can help cultivate those gains, earn those wins. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about who we are at the Center for Disaster Protection. I see many familiar faces in the room, some of whom we know and some of whom we don't. My name is Theo Talbot. As kindly introduced, I'm a chief economist with CDP in London. The center works for and with countries, organizations, and policymakers to find, develop, and share better ways of preparing for and responding to disasters. We have this precious mandate because the way the world is paying for crises isn't working. It is leaving the poorest and most vulnerable amongst us behind. Our global approach to tackling risk is to pretend that we don't know it's coming, and when it arrives, to improvise. We do our work by working on practical solutions, generating honest, cutting-edge research about what works and what doesn't, and working with policymakers around the world. Our team of about 30, some of whom are with me today, includes experts in finance, catastrophe risk, development economics, public finance, and policy engagement. It's a cross-cutting team because these problems are inherently cross-cutting. We're generously supported by UK aid, but governed by an independent board that includes government officials, economists, humanitarian leaders, and senior private sector representatives. Before I start with the in-country process of the Global Shield, let me start with the why. Whenever there's a process in multilateralism, it's helpful to ask this governing question: why do we need a new thing? So let me start, instead of today and here, a few decades ago in South Africa. How many of you recognize this device? Can I see a quick show of hands? Anyone? All right, let me tell you a little bit about this. This is called the play pump. In the late 1980s, a water engineer in South Africa invented the basic mechanism for using a children's roundabout, like you'd see on a playground, to pump water out of ground wells. The idea was to use the quote-unquote free work of children playing to pump water out of ground wells in order to solve a water access problem for communities without access to the grid or the money to pay for electrical generation. In 2000, the hype cycle kicked into high gear. The play pump wins a World Bank Development Marketplace Award and started to get a lot of attention in the international press. This culminated in 2006 when the project got a grant of $16.4 million from a philanthropic foundation, partnering with USAID and PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS in Africa, to roll out these devices across sub-Saharan Africa. It took a few years, but it probably won't come as a surprise that reality soon caught up with the hype. Donors distanced themselves from the project. Its main funder announced that it had fundamentally failed, and communities where the play pumps had been installed were largely left frustrated and isolated. Why did the play pump not work? First, it didn't solve the underlying problem. Instead of being an easier way to pump water out of the ground, concealing the pumping mechanism inside this roundabout made it much less efficient. In 2009, sorry, it's not funny, but it is a little bit funny, The Guardian calculated that children would have to play for 27 hours a day in order for the play pump to meet its water delivery targets. Second, it appealed to donors. It wasn't designed by the communities that would actually use it. As the South African artist and designer Ralph Borland eloquently put it in response to this device, Play Pump's success in captivating first-world audiences relied on its portrayal as a magical, innovative object that achieved work through children's play. Thirdly, because the decision to scale up wasn't based on evidence or on value for money and didn't consider alternatives. If you want a solution to pumping water by hand, I would recommend a hand pump, a field-tested, extremely rugged device that's installed in literally millions of villages around the world. Next, we'll talk a little bit about another failure. Everyone involved in this had the best of intentions, and everyone agrees at the end of this experiment that it has largely failed to meet its objectives. The One Laptop Per Child project was an ambitious initiative launched in 2006. These were meant to be rugged, low-power laptops deployed to the toughest places in the world in order to generate large learning gains. Apart from cost overruns and other issues, though, when the OLPC, the One Laptop Per Child, was actually evaluated, it should come as little surprise that the main constraint on learning outcomes in very resource-stretched settings turned out not to be whether students had an off-grid computer. Controlled trials of the One Laptop Per Child found that in Peru and Nepal, it had no impact on test scores in reading and math, had no improvements in enrollment and attendance, and changed no time spent on homework or motivation. It now seems obvious that parachuting Band-Aids into operating theaters won't change outcomes. But we only learned this the very hard way, after many organizations had deployed time and effort into this project, not least the taxpayers of Peru, who spent $200 million on 1 million units of the One Laptop Per Child. And it's instructive that 200 million is roughly the amount of money the Global Shield has been very successful in mobilizing. So I started this intervention with very different sectors, water and my home sector, once upon a time, of education. But here are 3 innovations that are a little bit closer to our home base of disaster risk finance, which we'll focus on today. First, of course, many of you know and are familiar with the African Risk Capacity, an innovative mutually owned insurance vehicle owned and operated in sub-Saharan Africa. ARC has generally excelled at getting money in the door after triggering events, what we at the Center for Disaster Protection call money in, liquidity going out the door. Recent evidence suggests, though, that in some cases, there's a fundamental disconnect between money arriving in government bank accounts and actually reaching poor and vulnerable households, what we at the Center for Disaster Protection call money out. This recent evaluation, for which ARC should be rightly lauded, finds that payouts in response to risk arrived in time, but in some cases weren't actually pushed out the door to households that needed them. So the money didn't arrive where it needed to be in time. Second, as many of us also remember, the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility used a combination of what were basically contingency funds and an insurance window, risk transfer, with the aim of delivering liquidity in time to contain the spread of a fast-moving disease. But when COVID hit, it turned out the insurance had been mal-designed. It had triggers that released too little funding too late to actually contain the spread of the epidemic. Third and finally, many of us have been closely following a landmark transaction led by the World Bank for Chile to transfer some of its earthquake risk to capital markets using what's called a catastrophe bond. There are many good things about this transaction, but a hard financial market like the one we're in means that this kind of risk transfer comes at an eye-wateringly steep price. It had a multiple of 4.75, which means, roughly speaking, that taxpayers in Chile can expect to put $4.75 in for every dollar of payouts they can accept to receive back. That's about 60% higher than the historical average for this kind of transaction. Once again, in this very new arena, there are some familiar lessons it bears repeating. We need to invest in solutions that solve underlying problems, connecting money in with money out. We need to design solutions by starting with the countries and communities that hold the risk. In the case of PEF, for example, by designing around what money would be available when. And thirdly, we need to compare impact with price and consider the range of tools that we might need to solve a problem rather than belligerently focusing on just one preferred solution or just one preferred provider. These are hard problems, but they are not new problems. In the design work leading to the in-country process for the Global Shield, in which we have been pleased to participate, it has kind of resonated that many of the global funds, which the Global Shield is not, but bears some analogy to, many of the global funds solve similar problems of connecting local information and ownership with global financing. It's instructive and useful to see that all of these global funds and others that we did an informal mapping address many of the same challenges and have lit upon many of the same solutions. First, a country-led inclusive forum to identify and prioritize problems that need to be solved. Second, to create a neutral source of technical advice. What works? How much does it cost? Does it cost too much? Do we have an evidence base that says this is the right solution? And third, to connect demand, this high-quality demand that's been cultivated, with supply, which in this space means financing. It's no coincidence that all three elements, country leadership, transparent technical support, and financing, also underlie the Global Shield's in-country process. First and foremost, a national government sets up an inclusive local forum to identify the financial protection that is in place and prioritize the financial protection that should be in place. Second, at the global level, the Global Shield can mobilize technical expertise to support this country-led decision-making. Third, the ultimate goal of this engagement is, as Red reminded us, action, is to fund things that we expect to work based on what countries have identified as their needs and based on what is technically sound. What does this look like? It's very easy to draw diagrams and think about Platonic ideals. It's a lot harder when the tire meets the road at the country level, which is the challenge I think we now confront. But as part of our design work in the Coordination Hub, thinking through what would make this work, what would solve this familiar problem in a new space, in a new sector, we also thought of some toy examples. So let me take you through one very briefly before concluding. One of the examples we thought about was a lower middle income country with a poverty headcount ratio of about 14%. It already has some policy building blocks in place. It has some level of natural hazard risk, and it faces the main hazards of flood and drought. The country-level consultation culminates in something that you'll see on the left, which is a sense of what is already in place at different levels of society and what would like to be in place at different levels of society. At the sovereign level, there might be a natural disaster management organization that's extremely technically savvy and well-run with an appropriate government budget line. There might be compulsory flood insurance in some urban areas, and there might be for smallholder farmers a compulsory national agricultural insurance scheme. But the question is, based on what's out there, what else can we fund that will provide protection for the poor? And this culminates in a package, a request, a technically astute statement of what is needed. And so we look at these green pieces as areas the Global Shield can cultivate and help deliver. Insurance for public infrastructure that covers a greater share of the risk or expected loss, data and models to catalyze a local market, lowering some of these technical structuring costs, an enhanced safety net to protect the most vulnerable and poorest amongst us, smallholder farmers who are beset not only by climate risk, but also by climate risk. That has been a very whirlwind tour of how we started with the problem, talked about potential solutions, looked at analogous models, and developed collectively a potential path to solving them. It's been a privilege for us at the Center for Disaster Protection to work closely with members from across the Global Shield Coordination Hub to create a process that builds on and builds in country ownership, country leadership, the kind of leitmotif that we've been hearing today. But to give life to this vision, my sense is that we'll need two things, not only from the countries who are the Pathfinder countries, but also from all of us in this room and the institutions we represent. First, we have to come to the table to support these countries as they test this approach for the first time. And secondly, learning from this approach, we need to see what works and be honest about what doesn't, knowing that we can collectively iterate and make it better. We at the Center for Disaster Protection very much look forward to working with all of you and with others on that journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Theo. If you would like to take a seat over there, maybe. Thank you very much. I particularly liked that he talked about failures, because we always say, oh, we learn so much more from failures than from successes, but we don't really want to talk about them, particularly if they are our own and hard journeys that we had. So thank you very much for doing that. I would like to ask the three more panelists to join me on the stage, and I will introduce them when they are up here. So I would like to ask Anne, Jan, and Lotu to come up on the stage, and somebody would relieve us of this little thing. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks. I thought we were going to jingle. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, I would like to introduce the three additional panelists, and then we start with a round of questions. And let's see how we are doing on time, if we do the second round of questions or if we start interacting with this very eager audience right away after the first round. So let's see. I would like to introduce Anne Kamau. Anne is a director and co-founder at AB Consultants Limited, an inclusive insurance consulting firm in Kenya that advises the insurance industry on how to design and offer appropriate and accessible insurance to low-income households, particularly microinsurance. She's also the CEO and co-founder of CoverApp, an insurtech platform that provides insurance services on the go from a mobile phone app and web app. Anne is an insurance professional with a mission to make insurance accessible to those who need it most. She has over 15 years experience designing, prototyping, and managing distribution of inclusive insurance solutions in Kenya and other sub-Saharan Africa countries. She serves on the board of the Microinsurance Network and is a member of the Insurance Institute of Kenya. Welcome, Anne. Give her a round of applause. Thank you. Then I'd like to welcome Ahulotu Palo from Tonga, Lotu for short, over there. He is the CEO of the Pacific Catastrophe Risk Insurance Company. He's been involved in various roles in Tonga's Ministry of Finance and the Prime Minister's Office for almost 20 years. He's also held significant positions at the World Bank, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, GIZ, and the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat. An economist by trade, he has vast experience on public policy analysis, sovereign loan negotiations, banking, investment, healthcare financing, and matters related to sustainable development, including, of course, climate and disaster risk finance. His background is in economics, public administration, sustainable international development, as well as finance and banking. Welcome, Lotu. And last but not least, the gentleman next to me, Jan Kellett. He's a corporate and team leader at the Insurance and Risk Finance Facility at the United Nations Development Program. Jan leads UNDP's work across insurance and risk finance. He co-chairs the IDF's Operational Committee, is UNDP's senior representative to the InsuResilience Global Partnership, and co-created the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance. Jan led development work in over 15 countries, was program leader at development initiatives, a senior research fellow at ODI, and led UNDP's climate, disaster, and energy external engagement. He has degrees in film and television and in political science. Welcome, Jan. Thank you. Thanks for welcoming this lovely panel. I'd like to start with you, Lotu, and talk about the Pacific Islands. The Pacific Islands are one of the regions most vulnerable to climate-related hazards, and your company has been at the forefront in the region to increase financial protection. I'd like you to share your perspective on the particular needs of Pacific Island countries and the barriers they are facing now to access solutions. Lotu.
Thank you for the questions. I think that's a very good question. But before I answer the question, let me give you some sort of a context of the establishment of the company. From 2007, during the annual meeting of the World Bank, the finance minister of the whole Pacific requested the bank for some sort of assistance towards creating such a facility like the Caribbean one to address or to respond to the disaster risk finance needs of the Pacific. And then from 2007, that request until 2016, and that's when the company was created. As you can see, it took 9 years. So from that 9 years, the member of the company or the policyholder used to be 5, now it's only 3, and I'll talk about it. Simply because of 2 reasons. The existing product that we have in the market that we roll out the country does not really fit well with the North Pacific, only fit well with the South. As you can see, in the Pacific, it's separated into 2. One, there are countries in the North, which is close to Hawaii, and the other side of it is the South, which is close to New Zealand and Australia. So the product that we have now, the cyclone, earthquake, and tsunami, it's more relevant to the South Pacific, not relevant to the North. So one of the countries, Marshall Island, didn't renew their policy simply because of that. They were paying cyclone, but they're not prone to cyclone. So one of the countries also didn't renew their policy, Vanuatu, simply because of the rise of competition from KTDO, from the World Bank, ADB, disaster instrument. As you can see, there are lack of understanding of what instruments is available out there for the whole Pacific. For some reasons, I think some of our leaders, they think, oh, there is free money from the World Bank is coming like the KTDO. Little they know these are not free money. There's a free money coming from ADB. And that rise of competition also affect our accessibility to the solutions being available, but I'll talk more about that. So that's the real reasons. And that's the need. The need for us is to have some sort of a facility. The need was requested by the Pacific Leaders Finance Minister. We created that institutions to respond, but there will be a lot of schooling required to undertake on the ground, to really comprehend what is the different of disaster, of all the instruments being available, because there are many instruments being available, the KTDO from ADB, the World Bank, as I alluded to, and also the Pacific Island Climate Change PCAP. I mentioned the PCAP because our good friend is here also. So, and this available facility has also confused some sort of a confusion on the ground. So there's a lot of education that to be done on that, but there's a need for money, there's a need for resources, there's a need, the money for affordability of the premium, because it's one of the key issues in the regions. So from the beginning of the company, since the establishment of the company, the premium was subsidized from Japan and other countries also. We are fortunate that we received some additional finance resources from German government via the World Bank to help us with further financing of premium for the Pacific. We also diversify our product right now. We have 2 new products going to be rolled out in the market or the countries around September, October this year. That's for flooding, and that's also for drought. And that's 2 products fit well with the North. So we are expecting some sort of a hike up in the demand, in the membership, because now when I joined the company, when it was established, there were resources coming from the World Bank, huge amount coming for us. And that's the capitalization resources given to us. But the political capital was near 0, or maybe perhaps 0. So there is a political commitment, it's required. That's one need. Not only from the local members, not only from the countries, but also from our corporate partners, like Corporate, like the World Bank, like other institutions also. There's also a need for some political backing from them. Because when the World Bank and the Corporate start talking about, whoa, we're having some sort of collaborations with us, it carries a lot of weight. So I guess That's that more like the context. Going forward, one of the key issues therefore the need for us, we need premium financing. We need the corporate shields also looking at us to work together in terms of creating some sort of a market. We can use our company based on a scalable solutions where we can be part of the policy conversation on the ground. The service that we offer, including everyone, is more inclusive. And the service that we also offer to the countries can change the mindset. Because insurance, they look at us as traditional insurance. No, that's a cost. So we have to use our service together with the global partners in terms of backing us politically and financially so that we can educate our people to start thinking about moving away from the reactiveness spirit to more proactive spirit. So by then, they can be able to take whatever ownership that they own. So I think that's where we are heading now. But I think the key point here, premium financing is really important for us for other partners also to help us create some sort of a market locally also for reinsurance also. We have requested, we discussed this yesterday with the corporate shield team to see if they can support us with creating this reinsurance because the reinsurance market now is hardening, so it's going to be costly. That may be something that we think about using corporate shields to partner in creating this space in the Pacific and also address the competitions on the ground. I know I'm running out of time, but I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you.
I can always come back.
Yes, you can come back. Thank you very much, Loto, for giving us this context and an outline of some of the needs. I'd like to turn to Anne. You're working in Kenya with AB Consultants and working with local actors from the private sector and civil society to make financial services more accessible for vulnerable people. From your experience, how can the Global Shields in-country process that Theo just described, how can that approach crowd in local actors and support sustainable local markets that serve the most vulnerable people? How can that be achieved?
Thank you very much. And listening to your question and in the backdrop of what has been said by all the speakers who have come ahead of me, we're looking at what will work, how will we be able to bring the national actors, the different actors in various countries together, get them to own the process, get them to run with the process, and get them to actually arrive at the results that we're all looking for. Let's say disaster risk financing, insurance, inclusive insurance, all this, it's a topic that has been in the minds of all of us in this room and even other practitioners out for a very long time. And the questions that we would be asking ourselves is, why is it that we have not seen results that are commensurate to the investment that has gone in over time? Because over the past 2 decades, maybe slightly earlier, there has been efforts to develop and to try and de-risk low-income households, countries that are most vulnerable. Why is it that it's not working? And I just want to mention 2 things that have been said before. One, I mean, so clearly by Theo, what he has presented to all of us, the children's water pump, you know? Why did it not work? And what he said is actually where the core of the problem is. We design solutions, we do not design these solutions with the end user in mind. But we come to a table, we think of solutions, we design them, and then we present them to the person who's supposed to be consuming it. And it looks nice, it looks, you know, innovative, brilliant, and to all of us who are not in the problem, to all of us who are not experiencing that challenge, it looks brilliant. I mean, like, why wouldn't children playing and pumping water make sense to anybody? But then when it goes to the community is like, my child will not play 24/7 to ensure, or rather 27 hours a day to ensure that there is water. And this is the challenge that we're facing. So coming to your question, how do we get, how does the partnership get the countries to, can it crowd in, you know, the partners and the actors in the various countries? What I would say is that where we have started and what we have started doing in Kenya is part of solving the problem, getting the country, getting the actors together to actually identify their own challenges, be able to identify the opportunities that exist, and also start thinking together, how do we harness these opportunities so that the solution is coming from in and going out, rather than solutions being created from out and being brought to be adapted. But can we be able to then implement solutions that we have identified to our own problems? And Having done this, maybe I can speak briefly onto what has happened in Kenya in 2 minutes, that a collaborative forum was brought together through a workshop that has been headed by the IDF InsuResilience Working Group, Inclusive Insurance Working Group. And through this collaborative forum in Kenya, we were able to identify what are the thematic areas that we want to focus on. And 5 thematic areas were identified: technical assistance, MSMEs, regulation, and insurance education, including smallholder farmers. And having identified these 5 thematic areas, then the other question is, what do we do with these 5 thematic areas? What are the actionable items that we can pick from these 5 thematic areas? And out of each actionable item, what is the objective? What is the end goal? What are we expecting to see at the end of it? And because it's a multi-stakeholder forum, and our regulator, IRA, the Insurance Regulatory Authority is engaged. Our Association of Insurance, the Association of Kenya Insurers is engaged in it. And then the private sector players, they are all engaged in it. And in this way, we are hoping that we shall see the change that we've all been looking for. Hoping also to pick up from what Theo has said, we'll be able to learn and learn fast. We'll be able to iterate and iterate quickly. And we'll be able to go to market with something we've tested and owned ourselves.
Thank you very much, Anne. I'm not wanting to rush you too much, but thank you very much for summing this up in such a short time and pointing out why it is so important that these solutions grow from the ground. Participation breeds ownership, we say, but that of course takes time, and I'm going to come back, I think, to that question as well. Let's turn to Jan and UNDP's work with the private sector. UNDP runs a global risk financing and insurance program which works closely with private sector to deliver needs-based risk transfer in over 20 countries. What are key lessons learned from this program that the Global Shield should consider, and how can ongoing efforts on that side be optimally aligned with the Global Shield and its new approach? It's 2 big questions.
Do you have an hour?
We have, you pick one that you would like to answer in a few minutes.
First of all, point of order, if I may. First of all, spelt my name wrong, again, Astrid. That's 2 years out of the last 3, so that's $1,000. Secondly, that photo, definitely, that's an old photo, I had hair. And third point of order, of my 2 degrees, film and television, by far the most important. And we can talk about that over lunch.
I would agree.
Thank you. I think for us, for example, looking at the Global Shield, the one thing which we're bringing in as our role, supporting Theo and Sarah and Martin and all the colleagues, Astrid, working on the one thing we talk about a lot, and we will continue to do it, is situated in the reality of countries. That's really what we're talking about when it comes to UNDP, because we're in all of the countries where the Global Shield is, sometimes with our own programming, sometimes just because it's UNDP. So let's make sure we always situate the work that we're doing in the reality of the countries. Because, I mean, let's be frank, it has been constructed globally by actors which are global, largely, some of which have country presence, some that don't. And we are coming forward with what we think is our best intentions. And Theo, you've articulated where we've got to date. And definitely we need to test out whether or not those are going to work. But let me just give you some of the reality points, if you like, of why we mention this. So let's just give you 1 point. So for example, we've been implementing this thing called the Tripartite Agreement, financed by BMZ. It's operating in 22 countries. We talked about scale and the IGP. 64 million beneficiaries is our expected number of those who will be financially protected through this initiative, working with 17 of the largest insurers in the world. During the 2 years that we've had this program, in those 22 countries, we've had 20 elections. Now, you might think, well, that's not so important, is it? Well, actually, it is important, because each and every time there's an election, you may have to actually rebuild, restart, recreate the initiative that you put in place. That's just one indicator right there. I'm going to give you a selection of different indicators. Let's also remember, I think, that we are also living in our own little echo chamber here when it comes to insurance and risk financing. So I'm glad that Red and Heike and others, I think here Theo also mentioned, that this is not about insurance really, it's about development. And I think sometimes we're rather wrapped up in our own world of insurance and risk financing, but we have to remember what are we actually trying to do? Financially protect people so that economies can grow, that people can make their own choices, so they can move forward, and that we have development more broadly. And we are rather wrapped up in our own. That's very relevant for countries. If you go and speak to a Minister of Finance, is insurance and risk financing the most important thing on their radar? I don't think it necessarily is. It might be right after a disaster. We know how these dynamics work. But is it going to be 6 months, a year, 2 years after a major disaster? Not necessarily. So that's rather important. Let me just pick out another issue, which in terms of the urgency, I think we've talked about it a little bit, probably the most urgent thing I've seen in terms of statistics from Africa is the report which the WMO released at the end of last year, which said that 4 out of every 5 African countries in 2030 will not have a sustainable water resource of their own. My question to the Global Shield is, well, what are we going to do about that? I mean, what's our contribution to that? So that's, if you like, just some of the scene setting. So what does it mean in terms of reality, in terms of how we, if you like, look at how the Shield should develop? So I think, first of all, definitely make sure it is fully integrated into what countries are doing. So it has to be about public financial management, it has to be about NDCs, it has to be about NAPs, it has to be about rural development, it has to be about all the ways in which countries are actually tackling issues of poverty, climate, and development. Bringing insurance, bringing risk into all of those discussions. I think, secondly, it has to be integrated and built upon the ways in which the international system is already supporting countries. So we have a multilateral system in countries. We have UNDP, we have the World Bank, we have others who are working in those countries day by day, have been for some decades, delivering and supporting countries and supporting their priorities when it comes to development. Let's make sure that Global Shield is integrated and supports challenges, indeed, what's already in place, but actually looks to enhance and build upon that work. I want to pick up on that word which Red so eloquently talked about. I think it was his first point, which is trust. So, for example, this is maybe my final point. When it comes to UNDP, there are probably there are 3 things we do when it comes to insurance, and there's 3 implementation points. So we work with governments to create the enabling environment for insurance and risk financing, working with ministries of finance, with insurance regulators, insurance market development. We work with the private sector to create instruments that actually can build financial insurance. We're not an insurer, so we always need the private sector. And thirdly, we look to integrate insurance and risk financing into development. And we do this essentially through 3 ways of implementation. One is, yes, we have a technical team. We have 30 or 40 people, but UNDP is 17,000, so we are influencing also UNDP. That's part of our job as well, as colleagues will know. Secondly, we're in all of these countries already, in all of the 170 countries, and we are working in development. But I think thirdly, most importantly, our biggest asset, perhaps in a sense, is trust, and is our ability to work with, at the country level, with ministries, with other actors, and be a foundation for things like the Global Shield to become a reality. And that's really our biggest, perhaps our most important offer to the Global Shield is almost in that space.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. And it wasn't an hour, but a lot of information that you packed in. Thank you very much. You also talked about the need to situate what the Global Shield does in the reality of countries, as the other colleagues have as well. So that seems to be one of the things that are challenging and need to be designed so as to include vulnerable people, so as to make it sensitive to national priorities and the specific context. And that's the question I would like to play back to Theo, when you gave the overview of the Global Shield's in-country process. It aims at more coherent, i.e. also coordination with everything that's going on, and systematic approach to closing the protection gaps. But how can ensure this process that you outlined, how can you ensure that it delivers on national priorities and is actually really situated in country to the specific context? How can that be achieved?
All right, good. There's a tendency in events like this to fail to pass what was memorably called the no test, which is we all say things that nobody would say no to. So why are we saying them in the first place? So let me say a couple of things that people might disagree, just so we have some heat and light here. So in the heart of your question was this word government, and this is fundamentally important: country ownership, government ownership. I think really what's in the heart of it, for me, the reason I wake up in the morning, the reason I went to bed late last night, is people that might not be included in that calculus, poor and vulnerable people, and the politics that happen at the level of every country, rich, middle income, or poor. So we start with thinking about governments, but this is where the tire meets the road of what do countries want to prioritize, and does their prioritization actually work for people who don't have any other alternatives? And this comes back, as you mentioned before, as colleagues have spoken about, the technical process around what do we expect to work, what doesn't work. So a few examples to really color this in. If you spent a little bit of time in the sector, you'll have known about the microinsurance revolution. You'll have known about the hype cycle, where everything was going to be solved by microinsurance, and then the evidence that right-sized that. There are facilities that have managed to spend astonishing amounts of money seeking to deploy microinsurance solutions that haven't panned out. And I think the risk here is that if we fail to do both these things at the same time, listen to countries but prioritize the poor, we'll end up spending money that doesn't actually deliver protection. And the third point, which if you've spent any time with me, you'll hear me talk about, is the flywheel of success or failure. Success follows success. We're at a point in the evolution of the global shield where if we do things that deliver protection, donors will get excited and countries will get excited, and this will turn from 200 million, which is, a million here, a million there, you're talking real money, but we're in a world where, 100 million was less than half of 1% of total ODA last year. I think we can be slightly more ambitious. A final point on this, if I may, is that it is a difficult sector as an economist to think about and work in. If you spend time amongst economists, the words you hear often are sample size, right? So a randomized control trial, borrowed from drug economics, is based on how many people do I have a control group and a treatment group. Sovereign risk instruments and many of the kinds of instruments that Anne has helped develop, that Lotte is thinking about selling, that Jan has been critical both in his younger avatar and in his wiser avatar in building, are what we call in economics credence goods. Their value comes from our fundamental faith that they will deliver. So I have health insurance. It will really help me if I get very sick. Inshallah, that does not happen. But in the meantime, the value of the health insurance is that I'm not saving all my income in case I do get sick. And in this sense, the combination of politics, evidence, and credence, politics and faith, if you will, have to come together. And that will be the heart of the flywheel I think we're trying to build.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Also brings us back to something that Rowan mentioned earlier. Insurance is not an industry. It is a societal institution as a community or as a family. And we need to think about, is that national or is that beyond? Thank you very much, Theo. I'm wondering, a lot of things have been touched upon, and I'd like to give panelists an opportunity to maybe respond to something that has been said. And then I think I would like to open it for questions and comments from the floor already. So is there anything that you would like to add and comment on? Anne, for example, is there something that you would like to add in response?
Sure. Listening to, everything that's being said and just focusing on bringing and you'll pardon me for this because I will talk about the end user through and through. But bringing the end user to the table and getting to understand what it is that the end user thinks and requires. I'm just also thinking about the commitment that we really, really have to solving these problems, because we hear from the, UNDP, we're hearing from, all these excellent speakers. And then the question comes to the solutions we are placing on the table. They're not, a snap of the finger kind of solutions. It's something that will take time. It's something that requires patience, something that requires, you moving with it to the long haul. So everything we're talking about here, it's excellent. It sounds so good. But do we have the patience to actually see it through to the end? We are introducing solutions to countries, economies that have not had this kind of solutions, countries that are more reactive rather than proactive in dealing with risks like this and dealing with the issues that we're talking about. And the reason for these reactive responses is that we have not built the mechanism to actually prepare and know that I can prepare, and when something happens, it doesn't have to catch me pants down, if I may use that. So the question to all of us is, do we have the patience to actually bring this countries to this level, these economies to this level. Because when you compare with the developed economies, this is something that has happened over many years. I mean, the issues of preparation, the issues of planning for the future, it's something that's inherent, inborn, it's there. But with the developing economies we are talking about, the vulnerable communities and societies we are talking about, we think about tomorrow. We don't think so much about tomorrow, we think about today, we think about now. Do I have food for my children when they come back home from school? Will I be able to pay school fees tomorrow? These are the things that are at the top of our minds. And so when we start thinking of futuristic things, it's something that we have to grow into, something we have to actually see, make steps into getting to that point. My question is, do we have the patience, And for all these interesting and innovative ideas that we're talking about, do we have the patience to actually work with these economies to get them there?
Thank you, Anne. I believe you might want to respond. Jen?
I'd like to follow on from that, if that's okay. I think those are very wise words. And I think maybe that's also coming back to the Shield in itself, and it's the Shield's relationship to countries, which is important. I think it's when things like the Shield are created, they tend to be, they're bright and shiny, they're new things. I dare to say new toys, that sounds a little bit more pejorative than I meant, but in a certain sense, they are, something quite new, certainly in the insurance and risk financing space. And if you think, for example, the insurance development community, the nexus between it, is actually relatively new, maybe 2015. It's probably the major point, the formal launch of the Insurance Development Forum, the formal launch of InsuResilience Global Partnership. It's been a relatively short order, and a lot of the institutions which are here today are actually created in the last 7 or 8 years, really, including ours. We had no definitive, coherent, coordinated program doing policy and program work in insurance risk financing in UNDP until basically 2015 onwards. So I'm thinking about how does the Global Shield relate to countries. So I think one hand has sense to not quite, if you like, build upon what's already there. And this may be, this is probably, it's just the way in which it comes over, Theo. And I know there are various mechanisms that are put in place. So, for example, Kenya is far and away probably the brightest star of East Africa when it comes to insurance development. We met recently. I was there with a colleague. We met with Dr. Mwangi from Equity Bank and ZEPRI and others. There are major institutions which are working and doing lots of things. Insurance is part and parcel of what they do. So there's that sort of aspect, if you like. There is actually substantial capacity and expertise in countries. I was in Pakistan recently as well, and even though Pakistan has an insurance penetration rate of 0.9%, which is very low indeed, if you go and talk to the Pakistani insurance sector, there's a lot of capacity, expertise, and drive. There's just very little penetration when it comes to the whole of the society in general. But there's another part of this as well, which is talks about you mentioned the word patience, and I do think that's important as well when you talk about the shiny, bright thing, and can we move forward at scale and speed? This absolutely has to happen, indeed. But some of it also is rather, I'm going to say the word, a little bit boring, long-term work, which doesn't get a lot of attention. So let's just look at actuarial science or actuarial capacity, which is the bedrock of insurance development. Let's just pick out. So I met with the head of the Financial Regulatory Authority of Egypt in Sharm. How many actuaries are there in Egypt? Can anyone guess? Sorry? 30. For a country of 100+ million. What about Nepal? 1. I think there must have been a higher. What about Ethiopia? 0. In a country which is one of the largest countries of Europe, they get all of their actual expertise at cost, significant cost from Kenya. Is that the reason why the country has 0.7% insurance penetration? Almost certainly it's a contributing factor. Is that a reason why the floods in 2020, which caused $358 million of damage, were largely uninsured? It's certainly a contributing factor. So some of this, within the Shield, its makeup and how it gets resources into the countries, has to also be to do the long, hard work of building a capacity, definitely following government, following industry, and working with them, but do that hard graft.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. Just following on from that, I'd like to turn to Loto, because I also wanted to ask you about capacities and about the attempt or the intention to have under the Global Shield Pacific region initiative. So, and you talked earlier about the difference between North and South Pacific region. In terms of situating it in the context, how can that work if the region is very diverse and you're supposed to come up with one process, one project under the Global Shield.
That's a good point. To avoid confusion, as I alluded to earlier on, instead of, for Global Shield to come in and create a new thing, that will create hell a lot of confusions on the ground. I think it's best to go and leverage on the existing mechanisms is already there, then work closely with it. Just over a year ago, when I took over these positions, I was thinking, hey, the key thing for me is to focus on stakeholder engagement. And one of my stakeholder engagement to see if I can connect with the global institutions like like the InsuResilience. And I reached out to her to see if we can cooperate. So we signed an MOU just to confirm that there is some collaborations being right on stone or something like that. So which is beautiful to do. And then having them to work with us in the Small Islands Forum, I think that will gain a lot of political intentions and also give us some sort of political backing, not only from the whole Pacific Island countries, but also from the global world. So it's good when we go out to the Pacific, listens to the Pacific, and also try to be an effective partner. And to do that, it's through leveraging on the existing mechanisms that is already established. But I wanted to end also with a conversation that I had yesterday in the UN meeting. And when we had that conversation, one of my colleagues was saying, a lot to look at this. More than 10,000 people assembling in this conference hall. And while we are talking, climate change is already giving birth to cyclone, giving birth to earthquake in some other parts of the world, but we're still talking. So I think we all know the science is very clear. Climate change has come to stay. Now it's the actions from our side. I'm sure there are out there are variety of instruments available there for us to access. It's just a matter of rolling out. And that's really important when you look at the country process that the InsuResilience is coming up with on periphery of Global Shield. It's important to contextualize it and make sure to build flexibility. And the decision making has to be in the middle edge or low, not at the top of the food chains. Because if you put the decision making on the top of the food chains, you're going to wait for another 100 years. So and nothing will happen. So make sure that you have identify where is liquid when it comes to the decision-making process. Like what I said, if you put it in the top of the minister's level, it's going to be a delay when it comes to implementations. So I think that's something that I wanted to highlight to make sure when we roll out to the countries, I think to also consider these areas. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Lotu. I'm wondering, Theo, is there anything that you would like to quickly add at this point, or shall we see what questions people have?
Maybe very brief, and I suspect people have a similar set of questions. So Lotu, and you spend a lot of time in the rooms that we are all trying to enter and have these conversations about. And it's striking that one of the really strong empirical results in economics is that the political rents, the returns to politicians from responding to, in every country, wearing high-vis vests and rolling up shirt sleeves and deploying from a helicopter gets you reelected. Doing the dull, boring stuff of disastrous finance strategies and buying insurance and the PFM arrangements so that the money has somewhere to go if it arrives tends not to generate the same return. So I'm struck by the example of Pakistan, where we're transfixed by this recent example of flooding, of course. We pretended to be surprised, but this was a 1 in 100 risk. A 1 in 100 risk has a 50% chance of happening every 70 years. If you're a district governor and your political term is 8 to 10 years, and it's a 1 in 10 risk, is that something you'd like to take? It's not something I would like to take. So I'm sure others will have reflections that are smarter than mine, but I'd also love to hear from Lotu at some point, and Anne, about your experience of communicating this risk to the decision makers wherever they happen to sit. Lotu's point is embedded in the technical layer of a ministry because, as Jan was saying, there are 20 elections in 2 years. But whoever you're speaking to, could you tell us a little bit about that crux of the conversation?
When I said earlier on, when I joined, the political capital of the company was near 0. So that was the first thing that I wanted to do, is to connect with the technical people, so that these are the people that will provide the advice to the ministers. So up to now, I'm not a technical person, I'm a politician, because I'm selling a political product. I'm selling it to the Minister of Finance, as I alluded to yesterday in our conversation. If the Minister of Finance of that particular country say no, we are dead. So I have to wear the political hat in terms of trying to navigate my way around in this particular country. Of course, we are from the Pacific, but we are different Tonga is different from Fiji, Fiji is different from Samoa, and all these countries, they have differences. So it's a matter of trying to understand the political economy of that political country, try to identify a political champion, and piggyback on that political power that he has, so that you can go in with it. And you have to be nice with them. You know, they're very egotistic sometimes, so you have to know the political world, how you play your political things like that. And also make sure that you secure resources to cover their premium. When you say, okay, I have a cover for you, I have money to cover for you, immediately I'll buy a policy. Fiji is coming on. They promised to us they will buy a policy in November, simply because, you know, they have heard that we are providing resources for subsidization. So other countries also, they have raised their hand. Hopefully you can see a member increase by towards the end of the year. So it's simply because of the resources available. We felt that it's going to be a tough sell, you know, but the political capital is really, really important for the business that we are doing. Of course, we are selling a product that maybe be perceived by others as a commercial product we are selling, but at the end of the day, we're not selling it to the private sector. We're selling, it's a sovereign product. So it has to be politically correct when you go out and talk to the politicians. And also at the same time, we are facing with a political turnover. It's very liquid in the Pacific when it comes to elections. So I guess that's my understanding, and that's how, you know, I don't know. Going forward, I have to be a politician, not a technical person. I leave that to my technical team to explain the technicality. When it comes to selling, I have to wear the hat of a politician.
Thank you, Lotu.
And I would tell some lies too, sometimes.
Yeah, well, we talk about that on the stage. Anyway, thank you very much, Lotu. I would like to give the floor to Anne, and also Jan wanted to respond, and then ask Guillermo and Angela to see if there's comments or questions from the floor in the room, and Leah and Ines, if there's what's going on in the chat. So, Anne.
Great. Thank you, and thank you, Theo, for that question. Now, when it comes to engaging the political arm of the different countries in what you're doing, it's a very delicate balance. Of course, the politicians, their interest is, will I get re-elected in the next term? And so whatever it is that's being talked about has to be something that will give them that political mileage and leverage and endear them to their community so that they can get, you know, into the next election cycle. Now, how we have been doing it and what I have seen in Kenya is that, like Palu says correctly, identify a champion within whatever political arm or whatever arm of government that also feels what it is that you're presenting, you know, that has a real connection with the need of the people from the ground. Now, if I may take just two examples from our Kenyan context and Kenyan experience, is that our current political regime and our current administration is an administration that has been put in place or in office by the what we call the common wananchi, common citizen, you know, the low-income people, the small-scale, small MSMEs, you know, the low-income and informal economy. And there is a term that is going out, the political promise was based on bottom-up economics, as in building the economics from the bottom going up. And so currently, right from the very top from our president, he is very pro, you know, low income, bringing solutions, building resilience. Now the question is the how to get to that point, because of course it's difficult to reach the president, but can we identify the people in the various arms of government and in the various ministries that you can work with? One good example, we're just at the end of designing a first ever human-wildlife conflict insurance policy. It hasn't been done, to the best of our knowledge, anywhere. And what happened is that over 3 years, we at AB Consultants, in partnership with development partners from the UK, we were carrying out research, trying to understand the risks of the communities that live with wildlife, because in Kenya, over 60% of wildlife lives outside of protected areas. And what is happening? The climate risks today, they are increasing the occurrences of human-wildlife conflict issues. The animals are encroaching, the humans are encroaching more of the wildlife areas because they're looking for more land to till and for more places to live and all this. So over the 3 years, we have been working, trying to understand the communities, research. And we went to government, to the Ministry of Wildlife and Tourism with empirical results of research. This is what we have done. This is what the communities are saying, and they are pro-insurance. Actually, they were saying we can buy insurance if it will be a solution to this. But then we know the buying power is very low, so what do you do? And what the minister then did is that he immediately put together a task force, because we worked together to bring in the insurance sector as the private sector, the conservationists within the country from all these NGOs that care about animals. We brought them together with government into a room again in a consultative forum. And we are lucky that the minister then was understood where we're coming from and can see the challenge. He put together immediately from that forum a task force comprising of government, private sector, and conservationists, and tasked us to actually develop a human-wildlife conflict insurance scheme. It was developed over the past 2020 coming into 2021, and 2021 coming into 2022, solution was designed. A policy exists, already approved by the Insurance Regulatory Authority. The insurance industry as stakeholders, they have come together in a consortium and said, we may not be able to bear this risk as one insurance company, but let's form a consortium and carry this risk. And it's a heavy, heavy risk. And so because of that, now when the current regime came in, and because the politicians, the technocrats within government, at least they do not move from, like the permanent secretaries or the, who are there in the ministries are the ones who have carried on despite the change in regime. Then they have still fronted this as a need. And I am happy to say that budget has been set aside in the budget that's now being rolled out, because our financial year ends in June, on 30th of June. We have funds available. The scheme is being piloted or rolled out come July, that's next month. And that's one of the success stories we can talk of, and seeing how private sector can collaborate with government, identify the right people, and actually get a solution that will get to the people.
Thank you very much, Anne, and congratulations for this development. Jan, you also wanted to comment on this question?
Yes, thank you. I mean, maybe just interesting to hear about what you're talking about, human-wildlife conflict. I mean, there have been attempts. I mean, I haven't focused in too much recently to construct insurance solutions, HWC, but largely failed because of the lack of the right kinds of incentives, going and maybe the evidence side of things, going back to what you started with, Theo, not being in place. Noble ideas, not particularly well constructed. That's also something we have to be very wary of course, in our work. And the issue about the political economy, I guess, of insurance and risk financing. Just want to dwell on that for a moment. I would say probably within the Global Shield, I think that's probably an area which is somewhat underpowered in terms of how much investment and emphasis we're putting on it. Because to a certain extent, I think we can imagine in all kinds of environments what are the technical solutions in terms of constructing the right kind of financial vehicles, whether they're sovereign, helping develop the insurance sector so that various other layers of risk are taken forward by insurance, by integration of insurance into public financial management, NDCs and NAPs. Technically, I think probably we know, broadly speaking, what that all looks like, and we have the right kind of tools in the tool bag. They have to be deployed in the right way, but we know that. But actually, are we going to get people to work with us and open the tool bag? And that's the key question. And I don't think necessarily there's enough emphasis within the Global Shield on that. That's something definitely I think we should collectively look at. Yes, it's certainly a political question. There's also the civil servants as well. There's a slightly different thing when you're talking about political economy and what exactly are we asking them to do. But it's all going to be down to incentives and what's it in for them in terms of their mandate and also maybe perhaps their political life as well. But certainly it's somewhere it needs to be invested in.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for those comments. Now, I've been looking into the room and people have been raising their hands. Guillermo and Angela are out there with the mics and do understand if they just hold the mic for you. I think we start with the woman in black here in the row, I think third from the back, with the beautiful big earrings, if I may say so, just so that Guillermo knows who you are. Introduce yourself and be brief and focused, and if it's a question to a particular panelist, let us know. If not, that's fine.
Great. I think it's a general comment and question to the panelists, but I'd be really interested to hear Anne's perspectives on this. So my name is Emma and I work for the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership. So we're involved in supporting the Global Shield and generally trying to get finance and action out there before things get worse. So First, I want to challenge a bit this idea I hear all the time about one of the reasons for lack of political will towards insurance being that it's, politicians prefer to be, arriving in the high viz vest out of a helicopter. And I challenge that a bit because people know if their lives are getting better or if they're getting worse. I don't know that. I think many of us experienced during COVID, all our politicians were very visible having photo opportunities, but then at the same time maybe we were experiencing very inadequate COVID responses, and I don't think it fooled us. People are not stupid. They know if their politicians are working for them and improving their lives, and I don't think they are blown away by them arriving in a crisis. In fact, I am not a politician, but in my previous career, was often a person in a high-vis vest arriving in a helicopter, and by the time you arrive, people are normally pretty angry, actually, because you're late, your solutions are inadequate, and they are often inappropriate. And I think that's something we need to think about, the value of the Global Shield, about the time to get the time and money in ahead so that actually it's not late, it's not inadequate, and it's appropriate to what people have identified they need. And I think people who are at risk have much more experience of managing and understanding risk than any of us. And I think we should be careful when we presume that whether it's a politician or a farmer or a pastoralist, if they're not interested in insurance, that it's because they don't understand it. It's probably because of other reasons and their difficulty to, I suppose, keep the lights on. And I think that's a really important part of finding solutions under the Global Shield, and in general asking people what are the crises that actually you find the most difficult to manage, and what are the financing challenges you have on it, rather than coming in saying we're going to do this for you, because people who are vulnerable in poor countries, they are not unaware of all the risk they manage every day. They know more about it than anybody in this room ever will. So I think that's really important. And all the actuaries in the world won't solve a problem if there not been enough resources or information for people to act ahead of a crisis. So I'm really interested to hear, learning from colleagues, from Kenyan colleagues, about how do we approach this, how do we embed that into the Global Shield approach so that we're not top down telling people what we're going to help them with, whether they like it or not. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emma. I'm going to take a few, and then you feel free to respond to what you want to respond to. And there's a gentleman kind of sitting near in the middle, and before I say a gentleman in a white shirt, that's not helpful, but you've had your hand up quite a while. Can you stand up so Angela finds you? Yes, there you go. And be brief and to the point, and if you have a specific question to an individual panelist, let us know.
No, thank you. I'm Melvin, and I'm from UN Environment Program. I note that the focus has been on insurance. My point is that climate risk insurance uptake has been strongest in developed countries, with coverage gaps of about 97% in developing countries. In addition to that, the recent IPCC and WMO reports suggest there's an increase in frequency and intensity of climate-induced sudden events, which means that we are basically looking for into a future of uninsurable scenarios. My question to panelists is what new mechanisms are needed to fill large gaps up to 97% in uptake of risk insurance and risk insurance coverage? And my second question, and hearing what Anne had to say with end users in mind, how better to address and cover for growing number of uninsurable scenarios in most vulnerable countries?
Thank you. Thank you very much to the colleague from UNEP. And there's a gentleman a bit further in front who's also had his hand. Yes, you, exactly, with the glasses. There you go. And then I'll look at the panel.
Thomas Wichers, GIZ's risk finance and insurance team. So in my previous job, before I joined GIZ, quite a bit of time I spent on taking, in particular, African government officials for dinner and sometimes even drinks. And inevitably, they will tell you, Thomas, these reports and these analyses that you, the donors, want from us, they rarely tell us something that we don't know yet. We might not know them in such a well-polished way. They might not stand up to each and every detailed econometric analysis, etc. But we do know if there's flooding, MSMEs suffer. If there's drought, farmers suffer. And it's not that the current architecture and especially the current size of the funding available for climate risk insurance, the capital in the system, so to say, is able to deliver significant, like really significant payouts. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the biggest payout of the African risk capacity is a double-digit million figure, which is minuscule compared to the size of the problem in Africa. No? And that's not a criticism of ARC. It's just a note. So the question then is, why are we doing these polished reports? Why are we setting up a country process that, as a gatekeeper, has a well-rounded CDRFI strategy, looking at all different kinds of stakeholders and risks and hazards and so on? Yeah, why do we front load this work also on the governments, on the constituents, as opposed to just getting things done? Yeah? And the second question, the second part of the question is on the political economy, because the political economy is that, yes, there are commitments, there are policies, there are NDCs, there are NAPs, etc. But the same African government officials will tell me, if you really want interest of the government, of the Minister of Finance, perhaps even of the members of Parliament, then you find a way that the interest rate on the next IMF program is 0.1%, 0.2% lower, because you have a national risk financing strategy, yeah, and not because you have a fancy, so sorry for the word, fancy CDRFI strategy, yeah, and that's the comment, perhaps the question to the panel.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I need to look at the time, and I'm just wondering if we are okay to continue until 10 past 12 or 15 past 12, and Jonathan says yes, so we're going to. I'm going to look at the panel now to see what they want to respond to. Personally, I find particularly interesting the question about uninsurable scenarios, and why do we need polished reports, and can we just go and do things? Anybody who would like to respond? Theo?
Anyone who says we need fewer reports is singing my tune. So I'll buy you a drink after this. So maybe I think people will have smarter things to say than I do. But to respond to all three, you're welcome to your views about the political returns to response versus acting early. The data is very clear. The political rents are higher for people that do things that are visible in responding. I think we can change that calculus, and that's part of educating electorates, asking political questions at the right times. But we're, on average, very far from that reality. You also made a good and I think fairly challenging point about actuaries. And you said 1 million actuaries won't solve the problem. The millionth actuary you probably don't need in the room. But the first 2 or 3 are actually very useful if they can start to ask and answer questions about the level of risk that politicians should be responding to. So I accept the challenge on extent. I think I reject the challenge on the need at all. Turning to Elvin's very good questions on uninsurability and the protection gap. Again, this is why I like to start with other sectors that I've had the privilege to work on, because you're asking about why low-income households don't have something. We've asked these questions in many ways about many different sectors. Why don't they have clean water? Why don't they have immunization? Why don't they have medically treated bed nets? And the answer is that they can't afford them. They're making optimizing decisions with the money they do have. And our question is, how do we connect the global public sector's money and capital, $202 billion worth of ODA, with those needs based on what will work in those contexts? You also mentioned this point about uninsurable risk, and I can see my colleagues champing at the bit. I very gently will push back on this point. You can insure anything for a price. It may not be the price the user is willing to bear, but this idea that something is uninsurable is mechanically wrong. The question is, who is going to bear that cost and for what ends? Finally, to Thomas, who owes me a drink, or to whom I owe a drink, one of my first jobs was, for my sins in a past life, helping with trade accession negotiations. And one of the first things I saw when I walked into a small office in the Pacific, in Vanuatu, which I called home for 2 years, was a trade report that was literally, not figuratively, literally being used as a doorstop. And I was like, there's the metaphor for you. So I accept that reports, I think, may be a margin along which we don't need to invest heavily. But I think it would be a mistake to say, just because we don't need reports, we don't need to ask the kinds of questions that reports can answer, right? And this is where I think the in-country process can be leaner. It doesn't generate lots of paperwork, but it does create a feedback cycle, bringing some evidence to bear. Once upon a time, it used to be reports. Now it's WhatsApp. Now it's Teams conversations. Your point about small payouts, double-digit million, again, a very gentle, let's pass the no test. It's true if you divide payouts by what's your denominator? By GDP, tiny. Government budgets, tiny. By the cost of response to pre-identified vulnerable populations, maybe it's not so tiny. I think the question returns to a point we made at the beginning, that it's not only about the money out quantity, it's about what you're using it for. So I accept the challenge, but I also think it builds in this question about what's the money for? I'm not here to protect government balance sheets. I think we're here to protect poor people. Finally, on the feedback loop, I can see Jan would like to come in on this link of interest rate. One final point I will make, though, is there's a risk that we have a tick box approach to setting loan conditions and say, because we have policy X, the country has a level of protection. That is, to use a very overused phrase, isomorphic mimicry, right? We think that because it has a strategy, we can expect to see results. I think there's a set of enticing open questions about the extent to which DRS strategies lead to actual change for vulnerable populations.
Thank you very much, Theo. Now, I bought you guys a bit more time just now, right? However, I would ask if you pick a question that you would like to answer and get back a little, because I've been indicating, the colleagues have indicated there are 2 questions from the chat that they would really like to share. So, who would like to make a remark at this point?
May I?
Yes.
Maybe on the whole money thing. So I'm going to wrap an answer.
On the whole money thing? Cool.
Yeah, there you go. That's the whole thing, isn't it, really? So the Global Shield is what, 240 million euros? I mean, it's nothing. Let's be honest. I mean, I was in Pakistan, for example, as I mentioned, and I made a comment actually around table, and we were talking about the Global Shield. Yes, it's important, but actually you could spend the entirety of the Global Shield money in Pakistan, and you'd probably not really tackle too much of the risk, to be honest with you. So we have to think about what it can do beyond the actual financial protection it can do now. That's why the long-term systems are also important, and the process and the political engagement. I do think it's really important, that political engagement. It's all about incentives, finally. So is the Global Shield looking to create, work, enable, leverage the right incentives with political and civil servants in country and industry? Not necessarily, I don't think we've necessarily got there yet, but that's definitely a place where we need to invest a lot of resources. I'm thinking, for example, about the paradigm from the DRR side of things. So maybe 10, 12 years ago, you're probably aware that there was a big push, for example, to basically make disaster risk reduction apolitical. So convincing governments, parties, politicians, and also civil servants, this is not a political issue at all. We know what's happening in the Philippines and the East Coast, the way the dynamics of cyclones are changing. It affects everybody. So therefore, if you're a politician for whatever slice, disaster risk reduction has to be important to you. And I think that probably, before Sendai, was largely successful, I would say. Can we do it also for risk transfer? Now, of course, the dynamics are a bit more challenging there because of the cost. That's where it comes to the money thing. And that's, of course, really key. That's where the loss and damage element has to come into it for the future of actually paying for the uninsurability of risks. And I agree with you. I think that actually, definitely, all risks can be insured. It's just who's willing to pay and how much. But maybe this point, just as a final point, just on the financing mechanisms, like ARC and I think there was a reference to about how much ARC, Thomas, you mentioned, had paid out. I think that was a good point in the sense that it's also about what the different vehicles are for. So, for example, I would say for the Pacific, for example, when I look at PCRIC and the work there, sovereign instrument covering all of the SIDS, covering major assets in a single, that makes a lot of sense. Small markets, difficult to penetrate for insurers, very high transaction costs. Why would you spend a huge amount of time building insurance markets of complexity in those places? But in Africa, large populations, fast growth, large urbanization, then I think you need much more than ARC. You definitely need ARC, it's useful. But then you need, ministries of finance investing their political capital, indeed, in sovereign risk financing and in investments in insurance markets. And that has to be for the long game.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Is it okay if we see what online participants are asking to then maybe for you to pick them up if you want to? Okay. So we have Leah and Ines watching the chat, and I'm wondering what was going on and if there's any interesting question to the panel.
Yes, thank you. We have a question for Theo, and it's related to how in your presentation you mentioned how the Global Shield will engage with governments and business and households. But there's no specific mention of humanitarian agencies, and it's important their role in crisis finance expenditure. So how to maximize potential of ex-ante humanitarian action and harness their operational capacity to support the money out challenge?
Can we have the second question, and you get 1 moment to think?
Yes, the chat has been very active. Actually,
Okay.
we just had to pick out a few of the very interesting questions. So one is on what kind of fundamental change is needed when putting financial services sustainably on the ground and reduce dependence over the years on funding, and what kind of indicators can you imagine for this fundamental change?
Thank you very much. I'm glad to hear the chat is active, and apologize that we can't hear them all. I'm wondering who, Theo, you would probably start off with the humanitarian agencies question, and then the fundamental change question. Maybe I'm going to look at the others on the panel. Theo.
Sure, a very brief answer, which is to say there isn't one roster for every country. Every country is going to decide within itself, led by the government, who is at the table and who isn't. I think we need to learn how to make that process transparent, fair, and inclusive, so it is an open challenge. But the answer will look very different in different countries. And I, for what it's worth, from my perspective, completely agree that in some contexts, it's critical that the humanitarians that are footing the bill for response and delivering response, particularly in parts of countries that governments can't access, need to be part of these conversations.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Anne Lotto, if you would want to pick up, you're not, but Anne, if you want to pick up the question about fundamental change and when do we overcome the need for funding and have fundamental change in development.
Wow, that's a really, really tough one. It's a tough one. But what I'm thinking, I'm not sure we can overcome the need for funding. It's going to take a very long time to be able to overcome that need. But in the meantime, perhaps the question should be, how do we maximize and make the most of the funding that is coming currently to build towards that, future where perhaps the funding will not be so necessary, but we can be able to do things within the various governments and economies on our own. And what I can say is that there needs to be very, very heavy, or perhaps this is debatable, but have more of the funding channeled not directly through the government and the political players, because we know as the funding is channeled through government, political players, then the decision making is longer, the consultative, the consultation becomes more complex. Who does government work with? Everybody wants in, and sometimes you don't get the right people in place to really work with government to get the solutions that you need out into the people. Now, I'll give an example. Let me go back to the human-wildlife conflict scheme that we developed recently. One of the greatest ingredients of this success is that the driving partner was not a private insurer, so there was no interest in, I want all these premiums to come to me. It was not government, so that government is wondering, who do I work with and how do I work with them? But it was through, and as I say this at the risk of marketing AB consultants, that's not what I intend to say, but it's because we are non-partisan, we are an independent market driver. And I think if more players like that can be identified who are driving forward a cause, not because you have stake in whatever the solution, the end game is going to be, but because you want to develop a solution that will last, then the other players tend to listen to you. They know at the end of the day, you'll not be in the pool together with them trying to get your hands into all this. So what happened, but then the downside of that is that as a what do I say? As a not direct beneficiary of the process, you end up putting in more work. You end up doing more that no one is paying you for. But at the end of the day, when you look at the outcome into the future, then it's worth it. But it also takes the heart of whoever is driving this. Is it something you're interested in for the future, for the impact? And thankfully, we've been able to do that. And you're able now then to pull in government, you're able to pull in the private sector, you're able to pull in the conservationists or the NGOs, and it can be replicated in any other sector. Can we identify a player who will not necessarily be competing with all the others who are looking at it for the end goal and the benefits into the future? And perhaps that's the one way that this could get to work. Who is that individual? I don't mean to say that it has to be a consultant, no, but who is that particular party that will be able to bring in everybody else and not be seen as a threat or as a competitor? Then the politicians will listen to you. The private providers will listen to them, and then all the other community-based organizations will listen to you. Give me one more minute to just speak into the humanitarian angle. Thomas supported one of the insurance companies, Thomas through the FSD Africa, supported one of the insurance companies in Kenya to design the first ever flood index insurance policy in Kenya. And again, once the flood index insurance, the research was done and the product was developed, but who is driving the scaling, or rather the pilot of this product with the communities? It's a humanitarian organization. That company is working with Oxfam. Oxfam has been trusted by the communities. They're the ones who take humanitarian aid. They're the ones who respond to disaster. And so if we can find more humanitarian organizations like this who understand the communities and who know how to actually disseminate who is the actual beneficiary, who is the real person in need, because they've worked with them before, I think that's what the role of the humanitarian organizations would be. And we will get to the communities more, and we will touch more real lives than if we try to work with those of us providing solutions, but we are far removed from the communities.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Looking at the time, I'm just going to go to the closing question. And we said we might have a few minutes, but now we end up having this half-minute thing. Anyway, we'd like to ask panelists about their vision, what the Global Shield should have been achieved, let's say, 5 years from now. We meet in 2028 and we look back, and we're happy that Global Shield did achieve what? So in 5 years from now, what do you think the ambition should be? In 5 years from now, the Global Shield will have. And I'd like to start with Theo and end with Jan, because he also wants to make one additional remark. Theo, in 5 years from now.
5 years from now, global vision, 30 seconds. All right, I'll do my best.
Just one thing that Global Shield should have achieved. One essential thing.
To me, the framing for this is modesty. If the Global Shield has a robust pipeline of countries who are interested in working with it, has deployed a number of financial solutions, and has a governance structure that people have bought into, that's credible, that donors and participants are excited about, I would chalk that up as a stellar success.
Thank you. Thank you. Sounds wonderful. Loto.
Be an effective partner in the region. An effective partner meaning, work together closely in providing premium subsidizations to the countries in the Pacific. That's the key for us.
Yeah.
And create the market. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Not just a partner, just for the corporations, and do more than that. Yeah.
Okay. Not just a partner. Thank you very much, Loto. Anne, what is it that the Global Shield should have achieved in 5 years' time?
In 5 years' time, at least have an effective working collaborative group in each country of operation that is actually implementing whatever solutions are being designed.
Thank you. Thank you. Patience and process. Thank you, Anne. Jan.
All of the colleagues said, but maybe just to add, maybe particularly to Theo, I would say integrated so well into the way in which countries manage risk and deliver development and growth, so much so that climate disaster risk financing insurance is almost unintelligible from the way in which countries actually do business, from the political to the actual practical, from the national to the local. I think that would be really key. But maybe just as my final point, which is related to this, which is the humanitarian thing. The UN, as some colleagues have heard me say at a few other forums recently, the UN appeal last year for humanitarian assistance was $51.5 billion. That's a tenfold increase than what it was basically about 10 years ago. If it was going to come out of ODA, that's a quarter of all ODA, just keeping people alive. It's important to keep people alive. Let's not be, let's be blunt about that. It's obvious. But is this the world we want to live in? So maybe there's another call to action here, which is the Global Shield really has to enter this space with the humanitarian side. And we need to see humanitarian financing finance actually ex-ante solutions. Not Global Shield financing better ways of doing humanitarian assistance, which we're sort of seeing. And that's a real thing which needs to happen. Let's get humanitarian assistance, 40% of which each and every year is driven by climate and disaster risk, pretty much. Let's reduce that down to 30 billion.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thanks for engaging in the conversation. Thanks for your flexibility to respond to comments and questions. Let's give the panelists a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much. just remain here for a moment. I think there is a slide about the lunch, and we shouldn't be between people and their lunch. Exactly. So we'll have lunch just outside where you had your nibbles and the coffee earlier. Bathrooms are still where they were an hour ago. And I'm sure you just started conversations and drinks and things. Pursue this over lunch. But please be back here at 2 p.m. sharp. We try being on time for hearing about the breakout sessions and telling you where to go. So see you back then. Enjoy your lunch break. Guten Appetit. Woo.